I first met Richard Peto in 1986 on a plane coming back from the International Cancer Congress in Budapest in Hungary. I was sitting across the aisle from Richard, and Richard was sitting next to Julian. And I can only describe what we had as a blazing row on the plane, to the extent that the stewardess came up and said, is there anything the matter? Can I help you in any way? Because Hong Kong, where I've lived for 50 years, had just banned smokeless tobacco. It was a new form of tobacco being introduced into the market, and we blazed it. We banned it. And Richard thought that harm reduction was an area worth exploring. He did not agree with this at all. And nobody was telling me we fought the American government to do it. We banned smokeless tobacco, and nobody was telling me it was a good idea. It was a bad idea. So when we got off the plane, Julian, with great courtesy, said, it's been very nice meeting you. I hope we'll meet up if you're ever in London. I said, ditto from Hong Kong. And Richard and I stomped off the plane without speaking to each other. But the reality is that since then, I've worked with Richard a lot in China. And just remember what China was like. These were the very early days. The picture right up on the top left is an example of British-American tobacco in the 1910s, advertising tobacco. They saw it as their prime market, rapidly followed by the indigenous tobacco companies in China, starting to advertise as well. And the foreign tobacco companies recognized China as really a dream come true. No discussion of the tobacco industry in the year 2000 would be complete without addressing what may be the most important feature on the landscape, the China market. And that's where they set their sights. So when Richard and I started working in China, we were faced with a barrage of foreign advertising all over the place, of sponsorship of sports events, sponsorship of schools, joint ventures with the foreign tobacco companies. That is the background in which we started to work on tobacco control. And of course, in those days, the Chinese leaders smoked. In 1981, Peto first visited China and was definitely ahead of the pack in that regard. But he applied this Peto principle from the days with Dole. Document the big problems, document how much bigger they are than other problems, use the data for public health action, and build capacity within the countries, which was really important. And in China, getting the data, he persuaded the late Minister of Health, Chen Minjiang, that tobacco was and would be a major problem. He started the prospective studies in the 90s. The China Kadoorie Biobank was set up in the 2010s, and I was very privileged to be involved with the birth of this initiation because I knew the Kadoorie family personally very well in Hong Kong and was able, with Richard, to persuade them to give a seed grant of $6 million to get the Kadoorie Bank up and running. And the Kadoorie Biobank is now institutionalized to provide data for the next half century in China. But our work, and Richard's work in particular, of talking to the Minister of Health, led to the first national prevalence study in China in 1984 by the late Professor Ong Xing-je. The next thing that happened was in 1987, China decided to have a national conference. And it was deemed that tobacco was far too sensitive a subject to hold this conference in Beijing. So we all had to troop down the river to Tianjin. And at the conference, they said, well, we are happy looking at some of the studies, we're happy looking at children and school education, but we certainly don't really want a tobacco law. But in the course of that conference, it became very clear that what China did indeed need was a national tobacco law. And Richard and I, with a computer in those days, which this is really what it looked like. We had one line we could see on the computer. We actually drafted the first national tobacco law for China, which was then subsequently adopted, and stayed up all night to try and get this law done before the conference finished and it was endorsed. And this, in fact, what Richard and I managed to draft became the basis for the first national tobacco law in China, which covered research, it covered education, it covered issues like ingredients, banning some of the advertising, and some smoke-free areas. This is the very early days, so this was really important. In 1990, China then established the first and only, to this day, national NGO on tobacco, the Chinese Association on Smoking and Health. And if you look at the particular ceremony there, you'll see Richard speaking, but obviously we had work and play. And this is with Mike Daub and Professor T.H. Lam and the late colleague of ours from Australia, Dr. Gray. So we look as if we're singing some sort of song, but we're clearly enjoying ourselves as well. But Richard, perhaps a bit unlike Sir Richard Dole, was very much into advocacy. And it was obviously very important in a country like China to try and work from the top down. So we had multiple meetings, several meetings in fact, with Madame Julin, who was the wife of the Premier, Li Peng. And I show this picture, somebody mentioned earlier about strewing documents all over the floor. I don't think Julin had ever had anybody in her office who strewed all these documents all over the floor so that there was a positive carpet of data and information with which to persuade her that China really needed to take urgent action. Richard was not with me, but I went on to meet Li Peng himself. And that again was a very important moment to get a very, very senior imprinter on tobacco control in China. Then in 1997 came the World Conference on Tobacco Health held in China. And at that stage it was particularly nice because the work of Richard and myself was recognized as to what we were actually doing in that country. In 2012, I had 3 days' notice, and I was in South Korea at the time. I had 3 days' notice to put together a delegation to go and meet the Party School in China. Now, the Party School is the ideological think tank of the Communist Party in China and occupies a very large area in the northwest of the city. And it's where all the senior cadres and department heads and ministers go for training, both in their topic, if you're to become a Minister of Health, but also in terms of ideological persuasion too. And under Xi Jinping, who at the time was the head of the Party School, before he went to even higher places, he had decided that the Party School would look into tobacco. And they put together the most remarkable 230-page document on what should be done about tobacco in China. And we were called in. I was asked to find 15 people to go with 3 days' notice to Beijing to meet with the Party School to look at this document. And actually, we made almost no changes to it. Richard himself was not able to come, but he asked Dr. Chen Zhengming to come along on his behalf and represent Oxford at that meeting. And I have to say, we found very little to say about this document. It was an extraordinary document. They had philosophers and they had economists, not a medical person in sight, putting together this document on what should happen about tobacco control in China. But what they were particularly interested in was implementation. How do we implement smoke-free areas? Is it the police? Is it volunteers? Is it the Ministry of Health who should do this? And they were very interested in the experience of countries like the UK, which Chen represented, and others. And when I asked the Party School, what's the status of this document that came out? I said, is the Ministry of Health obliged to do what you recommend that they do? And he said, well, let me put it this way. He said, 20 years ago, he said, we produced a paper on economic reform in China. In other words, it just happens. If the Party School endorses it, it sort of slides itself into national policy and becomes the rule. So that was a very, again, a very significant moment in China. And following the Party School report, I won't go into any of these details, but you will see from the State Council to the Ministry of Education to the People's Liberation Army, smoke-free cities, a commission on health set up, national health city standards, the Chinese Academy of Governments, which looks after the civil service, the Ministry of Industry, tax increases, the philanthropy more, even smoking was removed from the cool emoji under the sign of Weibo, a health promotion law. And finally, I have often said that as long as tobacco control remains under the domain of the tobacco industry, which, believe it or not, it was in China, until it shifted to the Ministry of Health, then it's unlikely we would make much more progress. And that's exactly what happened this year. They have removed tobacco control from the clause of the Ministry of Information and Technology. They've removed it from those clauses and put it into the Ministry of Health. And I think all of that work that Richard did in those early days contributed to that. And the second part is just looking at Richard's impact in international policy. And I think it's really important to respect the fact that he coined this global deaths phrase. It's all in one. 20th century, 100 million, the 21st century, 1 billion. That really has had a major impact and shocked many people and many countries into action. In 1995, several of us gathered, and people here today as well, in Bellagio, in the Rockefeller Center. And this was, again, a really important meeting because it put tobacco onto the development agenda. The result of that meeting was tobacco is a major threat to sustainable and equitable development. But perhaps, again, most important in the international arena, in April of 1998, Dr. Brundtland was coming in as the Director General of WHO, and she wanted 2 cabinet projects. One was malaria, it was a done deal. She wanted a second one. And Richard and myself, with Neil Collishaw from WHO, were invited to make a presentation, along with some others on other topics. We were invited to make a presentation to Dr. Brundtland, the incoming Director General, as to why tobacco should be that second cabinet project. And in July that year, when Dr. Brundtland became the Director General, she established tobacco as the cabinet project, and this led to the Tobacco-Free Initiative. It led to Empower, and it ultimately led to the setting up of WHO's one and only convention in terms of international health, the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, which has now been ratified by 181 countries, making it one of the fastest of all the United Nations ever treaties. And you can see the effect of it. Before and after the FCTC, about 103 countries had done any much work in terms of serious legislation. That changed to 152. And my penultimate slide just shows that some areas have done better than others. We've done better in smoke-free areas. We've done better on labeling, banning advertising, sales to the under 18 and reporting. But we've still got a long way to go on the bottom line, particularly with the tobacco industry. And the tobacco industry really to this day, and this is my last slide, the tobacco industry to this day remains a formidable opponent to tobacco control. And what they have now done, their tactics have really in a sense changed from attacking people individually and other ways to really challenging governments now. To the extent that almost if any country now wants to put forward useful legislation or tax increases, they're very likely to fight a challenge. That might be a trade challenge, it might go to the WTO, it might be a constitutional challenge, it might be a challenge in terms of trademarks. But this is what they're now doing. They're trying to obstruct and intervene with all governments taking action. For example, they maneuver to hijack the political and legislative process. They exaggerate the economic importance of the industry. They manipulate public opinion to give the appearance of respectability. They fabricate support through front groups. They discredit proven science and economic evidence. So that's why it's so important to have absolutely solid, reputable science underpinning what we're doing. And they intimidate governments with litigation or the threat of litigation or even trade threats. And I think it's really important to note that none of these threats, and there's been hundreds of them now, none of these threats have ever been successful. One after the other, the courts have thrown them out. So why are they doing this? They're doing it to intimidate. They're doing it to intimidate not just the country concerned, but to actually cast almost a regulatory chill, I would call it, over other countries as well. For example, perhaps if Cambodia were to see that, well, Australia introduced plain packaging and they got 3 legal challenges, how can we, a country like Cambodia, fight against the might of the tobacco industry lawyers? And that's why Bloomberg has set up a fund to try and help countries that are faced with this, and in fact is now moving into looking much more from not forgetting the importance of legislation and taxation and introducing Tom's project in terms of cardiovascular health, but they're moving much more into tackling the tobacco industry, because after all, the tobacco industry is a vector of this epidemic, just as malaria is, the mosquito is a vector of malaria. Tobacco is a vector of this epidemic. And I would just finish by saying that at one time we thought the tobacco industry was unique in being so dreadful, so terrible in the way it behaved, criminally smuggling their own cigarettes, etc. I think we've now come to realize that many of the other industries involved with non-communicable diseases, the food industry, the fast food industry, the sugar industry, alcohol, even the salt industry, is actually beginning to behave in a very similar way. And that's why tobacco is most important, because we've learned our lessons from tobacco in how to actually understand and cope and deal with an industry that is trying to undermine everything that we in public health and epidemiology people are doing. Thank you very much.